Episode 5, The World After the Crisis. October 1963. 1 year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world seemed safer, but tensions beneath the surface remain. Soviet missiles have been removed from Cuba. American Jupiter missiles have been quietly removed from Turkey. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty has been signed. The red telephone connects Washington and Moscow. But Cuba remains communist. Castro remains in power. The U.S. embargo has intensified, and the Cold War continues in dozens of countries around the world: Vietnam, Laos, Congo, Yemen. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed the nature of superpower confrontation, but it didn't end it. If anything, it made it more sophisticated, more cautious, more risk-aware, but no less competitive. Kennedy gives a speech at American University in June 1963 that marks this new approach. If we cannot end our differences now, he says, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. Because, in the final analysis, our most basic common bond is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all value the future of our children. And we are all mortal. It's a philosophy of coexistence, not victory. An acceptance that the Cold War will have to be managed, not won. It's a radical shift for a president who had come to power promising to be tougher on communism than his predecessor. But just 4 months after that speech, Kennedy will be dead, and with him will die the possibility of an early détente with the Soviet Union. While Kennedy was dealing with Cuba, another crisis was brewing in Southeast Asia, a crisis that would eventually consume the United States in a far more devastating way than anything related to Cuba. South Vietnam, backed by the United States, was losing its war against the communist Viet Cong guerrillas and supported by North Vietnam. The regime of Ngo Dinh Diem, the Catholic president of a predominantly Buddhist country, was increasingly authoritarian and corrupt. Kennedy had increased the U.S. military presence in Vietnam from 700 advisors when he took office to more than 16,000 by the end of 1963. But he resisted a full military commitment. He had seen how the French had been defeated in Vietnam in 1954. He knew it was a potential quagmire. In November 1963, with Kennedy's tacit approval, the CIA supported a military coup against Diem. On November 1st, Diem was overthrown and assassinated. Kennedy, upon learning of Diem's death, was visibly shaken. "We should have allowed that," he said, according to witnesses. 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was dead. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, would not have the same reservations about Vietnam. In 1964, using the dubious Gulf of Tonkin incident as a pretext, Johnson would massively escalate the war. By 1968, more than 500,000 American troops would be in Vietnam. The question that haunts historians: would Kennedy have escalated Vietnam as Johnson did? Or would he have found a way out, as he found a way out in the Cuban Missile Crisis? There's no definitive answer, but some close to Kennedy believe he would have sought a way out. That the lessons of Cuba, where he resisted military pressure for a warlike solution and found a diplomatic solution, would have informed his approach to Vietnam. We'll never know, but the difference between what Kennedy could have done and what Johnson did was literally 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives. October 1964. 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikita Khrushchev is removed from power in an internal coup within the Communist Party. The charges against him are multiple: crazy schemes, adventurous policies, damaging the dignity of the Soviet leadership. But the underlying theme is clear. The Cuban Missile Crisis is viewed by Kremlin hawks as a humiliation. Khrushchev had defied the United States and then backed down. He had deployed missiles in Cuba with great fanfare and then withdrawn them under U.S. pressure. Yes, he had obtained concessions: the promise of no invasion, the secret withdrawal of missiles from Turkey, but publicly he seemed to have caved in. And in Soviet political culture, dominated by ideological hardness and military machismo, the perception of weakness was fatal. His successors, Leonid Brezhnev as General Secretary and Alexei Kosygin as Prime Minister, represented a return to the hard line. Under their leadership, the Soviet Union accelerated its nuclear weapons development program, determined never again to be at a disadvantage to the United States. Ironically, This decision will lead to the largest accumulation of nuclear weapons in human history. By the end of the 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union will have more than 60,000 nuclear warheads combined, enough to destroy human civilization dozens of times over. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which nearly destroyed the world in 1962, paradoxically led to an arms race that made the world even more dangerous in the decades that followed. For Cuba, the years following the Cuban Missile Crisis were times of growing isolation, but also of strengthened revolutionary identity. The U.S. embargo, which began in 1960, intensifies each year. Cuba is excluded from the Organization of American States in 1962. Most Latin American countries, under U.S. pressure, break off diplomatic relations. Cuba became increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union. Moscow sent oil, wheat, industrial machinery, and weapons. It bought Cuban sugar at subsidized prices. It provided massive economic aid, estimated at more than $4 billion a year in the 1970s. But Cuba is also developing its own international identity. Castro aggressively exports revolution. He sends trained guerrillas to Venezuela, Colombia, and Bolivia. He sends troops to Africa, Ethiopia, Angola, and Mozambique. At its peak, Cuba will have more than 50,000 soldiers deployed abroad, a disproportionate military presence for an island of 11 million people. Internally, Cuba is transformed. The economy is completely nationalized. Private property is confiscated. A one-party state is consolidated. The rationing system becomes permanent. Dissent is brutally suppressed. But there are also genuine achievements. Illiteracy has been virtually eliminated. The healthcare system has been dramatically expanded. Infant mortality has fallen. Life expectancy has increased. Cuba has developed one of the best education and healthcare systems in Latin America. It is a system that its proponents will admire as proof that socialism can work, and that its critics will denounce as a dictatorship that buys acquiescence to social services while denying fundamental freedoms. Both perspectives have elements of truth. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba becomes an ambiguous symbol, living proof that a small country can resist the world's largest superpower, but also a reminder of the human cost of such resistance. Although ballistic missiles were removed from Cuba in November 1962, as verified by U.S. aerial inspections, not all Soviet weapons left the island. The Il-28 bombers were withdrawn, photographed on the decks of Soviet ships as they returned home. But thousands of Soviet soldiers remained. Technicians, advisors, trainers. By 1963, there were still more than 10,000 Soviet soldiers in Cuba, and conventional weapons in large quantities. Tanks, artillery, rockets, rifles, ammunition. Cuba became one of the most militarized countries in the world per capita. More worrying for the United States. The Soviets built electronic intelligence facilities in Cuba. Listening stations could intercept telephone communications from Florida, monitor U.S. military bases, and track rocket launches from Cape Canaveral. In 1970, U.S. area reconnaissance detected a suspicious structure in Cienfuegos, on the southern coast of Cuba. Analysis of photographs suggested it could be a base for Soviet nuclear submarines. It included submarine barracks, storage facilities, and specialized docks. The Nixon administration privately confronted the Soviets, citing the 1962 understanding that there would be no offensive weapons in Cuba. The Soviets initially denied this, then quietly halted construction. But the incident demonstrated that the temptation to use Cuba as a military base remained, that the 1962 agreement had resolved the immediate crisis, but had not eliminated the underlying tensions. Cuba would remain a point of friction between the superpowers until the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years later. The lesson Khrushchev's successors drew from the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't avoid dangerous confrontations. It was never again be in a position of weakness. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union adopted a more aggressive policy in the Third World. The Brezhnev Doctrine, announced after the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, affirmed the Soviet right to intervene militarily to protect socialism anywhere in the world. This led to further confrontations. The Six-Day War in 1967, where the Soviet Union supported the Arab states against U.S.-backed Israel, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where both superpowers put their nuclear forces on high alert for days while the battle raged in the Middle East. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which would become Soviet Vietnam, a decade-long disaster that would contribute to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. In each of these crises, the lessons of Cuba were evident. Both sides used a hotline, kept diplomatic channels open, and avoided direct confrontation. But they also continued to aggressively compete for global influence, constantly risking a regional crisis spiraling out of control. The crisis management and communication system developed after Cuba worked. There was no other direct nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union for the remainder of the Cold War. But there were several close calls, moments the public never knew about until decades later. Moments where, like in October 1962, the world came closer to the abyss than anyone imagined. September 26, 1983. 28 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world almost ended again. And once again, it was saved by a man who made the right decision under extreme pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty at the Soviet Air Defense Command Center near Moscow. His job, to monitor the early warning satellite system that would detect any U.S. missile launches. At 0:14 a.m., the alarms began to sound. The system reported an intercontinental ballistic missile launch from the United States toward the Soviet Union, then another, then a third. Finally, 5 missiles were detected in total. The protocol was clear. Petrov was to report immediately to the High Command. They would have minutes to decide whether to launch a massive counterattack before the U.S. missiles landed. But Petrov paused. Something didn't make sense. If the United States was launching a first strike, why only 5 missiles? They would have to launch hundreds, thousands, to have any chance of neutralizing Soviet nuclear forces. Could it be a system error? The early warning satellites were new, not fully tested. The computers showed high confidence in detection, but Petrov trusted his intuition more than the machines. He decided to wait. He reported the incident as a system malfunction, not an actual attack. Minutes passed. The missiles, if real, would have hit, but there were no explosions. There was no destruction. The ground-based radar system, which had detected the missiles in their final phase, showed nothing. Petrov was right. It had been a mistake. The satellites had mistaken the sun's reflection in the clouds for missile exhaust plumes. If Petrov had followed protocol, he would have reported the attack. The Soviet High Command, paranoid about the NATO military exercise Able Archer 83, taking place that same week, could have ordered the counterattack, and World War III would have started due to a computer error and a reflection of the sun. Petrov was reprimanded for failing to follow procedures. His decision was classified for years. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union did his story become public knowledge. In 2006, he received an award from the Association of World Citizens, inscribed, "To the man who prevented nuclear war." Like Vasily Arkhipov 21 years earlier, Petrov saved the world. And like Arkhipov, almost no one knew his name for decades. Ronald Reagan came to power in 1981 with harshly anti-communist rhetoric. He called the Soviet Union the evil empire. He launched the largest peacetime buildup of U.S. military weapons. He proposed a Strategic Defense Initiative program, popularly known as Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system. The Soviets, under the aging leadership of Brezhnev, and then his equally elderly successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, responded with their own military buildup. Tensions reached levels not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But then something changed. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in Moscow. At 54, he was young by Soviet standards, educated, and reformist. He understood that the Soviet Union was crumbling under the weight of its military spending and dysfunctional economy. Gorbachev proposed glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. More crucially, he proposed a dramatic reduction in nuclear weapons. Reagan, surprisingly, responded positively. Despite his hardline rhetoric, Reagan had a genuine horror of nuclear weapons. He had seen the nuclear war simulations. He knew there was no possible victory. In November 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Geneva. It was the first summit between American and Soviet leaders in 6 years. They walked together without their advisors, spoke directly, and found common ground. A year later, in Reykjavik, Iceland, they nearly agreed to the total elimination of all nuclear weapons. The agreement collapsed at the last minute due to disagreements over the Star Wars program, but the fact that it was seriously discussed marked a fundamental change. In 1987, they signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles. It was the first treaty to actually reduce nuclear arsenals rather than simply limit their growth. By 1989, the Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall fell in November. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself had dissolved. The confrontation that had begun at the end of World War II, which had threatened to destroy the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis, finally ended, not with nuclear war, but with the internal collapse of one of the contenders. The collapse of the Soviet Union was devastating for Cuba. Overnight, massive Soviet subsidies disappeared. Oil shipments halted. Trade evaporated. Cuba entered what Castro called a special period in time of peace, a euphemism for a brutal economic crisis. Cuban GDP fell 35% between 1990 and 1993. Food was scarce. Blackouts were constant. Transportation nearly ground to a halt due to lack of fuel. Castro predicted that the regime would not survive. Western experts predicted its imminent fall. The U.S. embargo was intensified with the Helms-Burton Act in 1996, designed to strangle Cuba economically now that it had lost its Soviet benefactor. But Castro survived. The regime implemented limited economic reforms. It allowed some private enterprise, legalized the U.S. dollar, and opened up tourism. Cuba began developing trade relations with Canada, Europe, and Latin America, and he discovered new allies. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez sent subsidized oil in exchange for Cuban doctors and teachers. China increased its trade. European tourism boomed. By the beginning of the 21st century, Cuba had stabilized into a new normal. Still poor, still under a one-party regime, but surviving. In 2008, Fidel Castro, now in his 80s and ailing, officially handed over power to his brother Raul. It was the first leadership transition in Cuba in 49 years. Raul implemented additional gradual reforms. He allowed more private enterprise, relaxed travel restrictions, and released political prisoners. But he maintained the party's control over policy. And the legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis remained. Cuba remained an official enemy of the United States. The embargo continued, and diplomatic relations were non-existent. December 17, 2014. 52 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Presidents Barack Obama and Raul Castro simultaneously announced the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. It's a historic moment. Obama speaks of leaving behind a decades-long policy that failed to advance our interests. Castro speaks of a new chapter in our relations. The details are pragmatic: reopening embassies, relaxing travel restrictions, increasing permitted trade, and cooperating on health and environmental issues. A full embargo would require congressional action, which is lacking, but the barriers are beginning to crumble. In March 2016, Obama visits Cuba, the first U.S. president to do so since Calvin Coolidge in 1928. He walks through Old Havana. He meets with private entrepreneurs. He gives a speech broadcast live throughout Cuba. "I've come here to bury the last remnants of the Cold War in the Americas," Obama says. It's a powerful statement, an acknowledgement that the policies designed in response to the Cuban Missile Crisis had outlived their usefulness by half a century. But the moment is brief. Fidel Castro dies in November 2016 at the age of 90. A month later, Donald Trump is elected president of the United States. Trump reverses many of Obama's openings, reimposing harsh restrictions. By 2020, U.S.-Cuba relations were once again frozen, though not at the level of outright hostility of the 1960s. The Cuban Missile Crisis, more than half a century later, continues to cast a shadow over relations between the two countries. But while politicians debate embargoes and diplomacy, a secret remains hidden in classified files in Washington, Moscow, and Havana. A secret about what really happened during those 13 days in October 1962. A secret that involves a third nation, one that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union wanted to admit was involved. A nation that nearly single-handedly unleashed nuclear war. A nation that had its own plans for missiles in Cuba. A nation whose involvement, if revealed in 1962, would have completely changed the understanding of the crisis. The archives finally began to be opened in 2018. What they revealed was astonishing. China, the People's Republic of China, was more involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis than anyone suspected, and its role could have turned a bilateral crisis into a three-front global war. Episode 6, The Third Superpower, Beijing, October 1962. While the world watched the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union over Cuba, another nuclear superpower watched with calculating attention, the People's Republic of China. Documents declassified in 2018 from Chinese, Soviet, and American archives revealed that China played a much more active role in the Cuban Missile Crisis than official histories had acknowledged. Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader, saw the crisis as a test of the Soviet would confront American imperialism. China had secretly developed its own nuclear weapons, with initial Soviet assistance that was later withdrawn when relations between Moscow and Beijing deteriorated. By 1962, the Sino-Soviet split was in full swing. Mao accused Khrushchev of revisionism, of abandoning revolutionary principles, of seeking peaceful coexistence with capitalism rather than confrontation. Khrushchev considered Mao dangerously radical, a fanatic willing to risk nuclear war for pure ideology. But Cuba presented an opportunity. Castro was ideologically closer to Mao than to Khrushchev. Che Guevara, in particular, admired the Maoist model of permanent peasant revolution. In August 1962, while the Soviets were deploying missiles in Cuba, a Cuban delegation visited Beijing. Officially, it was to discuss trade. But Chinese documents reveal that they also discussed military cooperation and possible supplies of Chinese weapons if relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated. Mao offered something extraordinary. If the United States invaded Cuba and the Soviet Union didn't respond with sufficient force, China would send volunteers to Cuba. It was the same tactic China had used in Korea in 1950, sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers disguised as volunteers instead of official Chinese military troops. Castro, pragmatically, didn't reject the offer, but he didn't formally accept it either. He knew that having both Soviet and Chinese support could be advantageous, but he also knew that being caught in the middle of their rivalry could be fatal. To understand China's role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we must go back to the evolution of Sino-Soviet relations after the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949. Initially, relations were close. Stalin immediately recognized Mao's new regime. He signed the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance in 1950. The Soviet Union sent thousands of technical advisors to China, helped build hundreds of factories, and provided nuclear technology. But tension soon arose. Mao felt Stalin had treated him condescendingly, like a minor revolutionary. During the Korean War, Mao felt Stalin had manipulated China into doing the bloody work of confronting the United States, while the Soviet Union remained on the sidelines. After Stalin's death in 1953, Khrushchev implemented a de-Stalinization program, denouncing the crimes of the deceased dictator. Mao saw this as ideological weakness. He himself was in the midst of the Great Leap Forward, a campaign of forced collectivization that would cause the deaths of 30 to 45 million people from starvation between 1958 and 1962. In 1959, the Soviets canceled their assistance to China's nuclear program. They withdrew all their technical advisors from China in 1960. The rupture was complete. By 1962, China and the Soviet Union were open rivals for leadership of the global communist movement. Each international crisis became an opportunity for each side to demonstrate its ideological superiority over the other. What made Mao particularly dangerous during the Cuban Missile Crisis was his attitude toward nuclear war. Unlike Kennedy and Khrushchev, who had come to understand the horror of nuclear weapons, Mao seemed almost indifferent to them. At a conference of communist parties in Moscow in 1957, Mao had famously declared, "We should not fear nuclear war. Of the 700 million people in China, even if we lose 300 million, what does it matter? War is war. Years will pass, and we will have more babies than ever." Khrushchev, who was present at that meeting, was horrified. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I realized then that Mao had absolutely no respect for the value of human life. He was a completely amoral man who viewed people as cattle." This attitude informed China's response to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Documents from the Chinese Foreign Ministry show that Mao viewed the crisis as a test of revolutionary will. He urged the Soviets to stand firm, not to retreat, and to be prepared to risk war if necessary. On October 25th, with the crisis at its peak, Mao sent a message to Khrushchev through party channels. U.S. imperialism is a paper tiger. It will not be intimidated by nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union must demonstrate that socialism does not fear imperialism. It was, in effect, pressure on Khrushchev to keep the missiles in Cuba, even if it meant nuclear war. What Washington didn't know during the Cuban Missile Crisis was that China had its own intelligence network in Cuba, operating independently of the Soviets and providing information to Beijing that wasn't always shared with Moscow. Chinese agents, disguised as agricultural advisors and trade technicians, monitored both the Soviet forces in Cuba and the U.S. response to the crisis. They reported directly to the Chinese Communist Party's International Liaison Department, the agency responsible for relations with other communist parties. These reports, now partially declassified, reveal that China was particularly interested in Soviet technical expertise. How good were Soviet missiles really? How well trained were the troops? How effective was their coordination with the Cubans? The information was valuable to China's nuclear program, which continued after the withdrawal of Soviet assistance. China would detonate its first nuclear bomb in October 1964, just 2 years after the missile crisis, becoming the world's 5th largest nuclear power. But there was something else in the Chinese intelligence reports from Cuba, something that suggested China was contemplating something more than mere observation. In Chinese military archives briefly opened in 2018 before being reclassified, historians discovered extraordinary documents, contingency plans for deploying Chinese troops to Cuba in the event of a U.S. invasion. The plan, known internally as Operation Red Caribbean, called for the dispatch of up to 50,000 Chinese volunteers to Cuba. They would be transported on Soviet ships with Moscow's reluctant cooperation, although documents suggest that China would prepare to proceed even without full Soviet approval. The volunteers would be primarily light infantry forces, trained in guerrilla warfare. The model was a Chinese intervention in Korea, where massive waves of Chinese infantry had compensated for American technological superiority with numbers and a willingness to accept massive casualties. The strategic objective was clear. If the United States invaded Cuba, China would turn the island into a bloody swamp that would drag the United States into a protracted war. Vietnam before Vietnam. Documents indicate that the plan was presented to the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo on October 20th, 1962, just as the crisis was entering its most dangerous phase. Mao approved it in principle, on the condition that Castro formally request Chinese assistance. But Castro never made that request. He knew that bringing Chinese troops into Cuba without consulting the Soviets would destroy his relationship with Moscow. And without Soviet support, Cuba could not survive economically. Still, the fact that China was seriously preparing such an intervention reveals how close the world came not only to a bilateral nuclear war, but to a conflict that would have involved the 3 largest military powers on the planet. When Khrushchev announced a withdrawal of missiles from Cuba on October 28th, the official Chinese response was one of barely concealed disdain. The editorial in the People's Daily, the official organ of the Chinese Communist Party, published on October 30th, was scathing. The adventurism of the Soviet revisionists in deploying the missiles was matched only by their capitulation in withdrawing them under imperialist pressure. They have demonstrated that they are not reliable leaders of the world socialist movement. It was a devastating accusation in the context of the ideological Cold War. China was publicly stating that the Soviet Union had proven itself cowardly, weak, and unworthy of leading the global resistance against capitalism. In private, the criticism was even harsher. Chinese Politburo documents show that Mao called Khrushchev a frightened fool who had given away a strategic victory in exchange for empty promises. This Chinese condemnation had real consequences. It strengthened the position of hawks within the Kremlin, who viewed the resolution of the crisis as humiliating. It contributed to Khrushchev's eventual fall in 1964, but it also solidified the Sino-Soviet rift. By the late 1960s, China and the Soviet Union were on the brink of war, with massive border clashes in 1969 killing hundreds of soldiers on both sides. The Cold War, which had been primarily a bipolar confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, became a triangular competition, and that triangle would make the world more unstable, not less, in the decades to come. For Fidel Castro, the Cuban Missile Crisis and its aftermath highlighted an uncomfortable reality. Cuba was a pawn in games between superpowers, not an independent actor. The Soviets had decided to deploy missiles in Cuba without fully consulting Castro about the implications. They had then decided to withdraw them, again without any real consultation. Cuban sovereignty had been violated by both its ally and its enemy. China offered an attractive ideological alternative, the Maoist model of permanent revolution, self-reliance, and a willingness to challenge the superpowers resonated with Castro and especially Che Guevara. In the years following the crisis, Cuba flirted with Beijing. It increased trade with China. It invited Chinese delegations. Che Guevara visited China in 1965 and was impressed. But the economic reality was unyielding. Only the Soviet Union had the resources to keep Cuba afloat. Soviet subsidies were measured in billions. China, still recovering from the famines of the Great Leap Forward, could not compete. So Castro played a delicate game, maintaining the Soviet alliance that was essential to Cuba's economic survival, while simultaneously cultivating relations with China to give himself options and demonstrate to Moscow that it couldn't take Cuba for granted. It was high-tension diplomacy. It required Castro to constantly demonstrate his revolutionary loyalty while navigating between two communist giants who increasingly hated each other. Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine revolutionary who had been an integral part of the Cuban Revolution, was the strongest link between Cuba and China. Che Guevara was a true believer in permanent revolution. He believed that compromise was treason, that peaceful coexistence with capitalism was impossible, and that the only option was constant and global struggle. These beliefs placed him closer to Mao than to Khrushchev. During his visit to China in 1965, Che Guevara was received as a hero. Mao called him a true revolutionary, not a bureaucrat disguised as a socialist, a thinly veiled criticism of the Soviet leadership. Che proposed a radical vision to Mao, to create 2, 3 mini Vietnams, multiple simultaneous wars of liberation in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that would overwhelm the United States' ability to respond and eventually bring down the global capitalist system. Mao supported the idea rhetorically, but China lacked the resources to fund multiple simultaneous revolutions. Still, he provided some support: guerrilla training, small arms, propaganda. Che Guevara left Cuba in 1965 to start revolutions in the Congo and then Bolivia. Both failed. Che Guevara was captured and executed in Bolivia in October 1967. His death marked the end of the strongest revolutionary connection between Cuba and China. Castro, always more pragmatic than Che Guevara, aligned himself more firmly with the Soviet Union after that. March 1969. 7 years after the missile crisis, the world faced another nuclear crisis that received far less international attention but was equally dangerous. Chinese and Soviet troops engaged in massive fighting along their disputed border on the Ushuri River. Hundreds died in battles involving tanks, artillery, and airstrikes. What the public didn't know was how close both sides came to using nuclear weapons against each other. Soviet documents declassified in the 1990s revealed that the Soviet Politburo seriously discussed a preemptive nuclear strike against Chinese nuclear facilities. The plan, known as Operation Tempest, called for the use of tactical nuclear weapons against Chinese military bases along the border, followed by massive conventional strikes. The idea was to neutralize the Chinese threat before its nuclear arsenal grew too large. In 1969, China had only a handful of nuclear weapons and limited delivery systems. The Soviet Union had thousands of warheads and overwhelming air superiority. The Soviets discreetly consulted with the United States about their reaction to such an attack. The American response was ambiguous, with neither approval nor clear condemnation. In the end, the Soviet nuclear attack on China never occurred. The reasons are debated. Some historians believe the Soviets feared that even a few surviving Chinese nuclear weapons could reach Soviet cities. Others believe international opposition would have been too costly. But for weeks in March 1969, the world teetered on the brink of the first nuclear war between communist states. And the Cuban Missile Crisis had been part of the chain of events that led to that point. Khrushchev's perceived humiliation, Chinese criticism, intensified rivalry. February 1972. 10 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Richard Nixon lands in Beijing for a historic visit. He is the first U.S. president to visit the People's Republic of China. The world watches in amazement as Nixon, the veteran anti-communist, shakes hands with Mao Zedong and toasts Zhou Enlai. It is one of the most dramatic diplomatic shifts of the Cold War. The logic was simple but profound. The United States and China shared a common enemy in the Soviet Union. By establishing relations with China, the United States created a strategic triangle where it could play both communist powers against each other. For China, the relationship with the United States provided security against the Soviet threat and access to Western technology and markets that were essential to Chinese modernization. For the Soviet Union, it was a strategic nightmare. It now faced potential enemies on two fronts, East and West. Cuba watched these developments with growing horror. The revolutionary world had envisioned a solid alliance of socialist states against capitalist imperialism was fragmenting. China and the Soviet Union were enemies. China and the United States were now something resembling allies. Where did that leave Cuba? Castro responded by aligning himself even more closely with Moscow. Cuba became the Soviet Union's most reliable ally in the Third World, deploying troops in Angola, Ethiopia, and other African countries to support Soviet-backed movements. It was a gamble for survival. Without superpower support, Cuba could not maintain its independence from the United States. And if China was no longer an option, only the Soviet Union remained. By the time the Cold War ended in 1991, the United States-Soviet Union-China triangle had defined decades of global politics. The Cuban Missile Crisis, long viewed as a bilateral event between Washington and Moscow, was actually a pivotal moment in the evolution of that triangle. China's response to the crisis, its criticism of Soviet cowardice, accelerated the Sino-Soviet rupture and eventually made possible the U.S.-China rapprochement under Nixon. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 transformed the triangle once again. The United States was now the sole superpower, but China was rapidly emerging as a potential rival. By the 21st century, the U.S.-China relationship had become the most important in the world. And the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis about crisis management, communication, avoiding unwanted escalation, remained relevant. In 2023, as tensions over Taiwan escalated, with China conducting massive military exercises and the United States reinforcing its commitment to defending the island, analysts invoked the Cuban Missile Crisis as a precedent and warning. Could a crisis over Taiwan escalate into another moment of nuclear confrontation? Had both powers learned the lessons of 1962 about the importance of clear lines of communication and careful escalation management? Or had the passage of time eroded those lessons, making it possible for a new generation of leaders to make the same mistakes that Kennedy and Khrushchev narrowly avoided in October 1962? But there's one aspect of the Cuban Missile Crisis that remains even more urgently relevant in the 21st century. An aspect that doesn't involve superpowers or global ideologies, but something more fundamental and terrifying. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just about politics or strategy. It was about fallible human beings making decisions about weapons that could destroy civilization. It was about complex technological systems that could fail in unpredictable ways. It was about the constant possibility that an accident, a misunderstanding, a technical failure could trigger the apocalypse. And in the 21st century, those dangers have not diminished. In fact, they have increased. Because there aren't two nuclear superpowers now. There are 9, and the technology is much more complex. And early warning systems are more automated. And decision-making time has been reduced from minutes to seconds. And there are new threats that Kennedy and Khrushchev never imagined. Cyber attacks that could masquerade as missile launches, terrorists trying to obtain nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence making military decisions. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't the end of the nuclear threat. It was only the first act. And the final act of this story has yet to be written. Episode 7, The Bomb of the 21st Century, January 2025. 62 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world faces a radically different and more dangerous nuclear landscape. In 1962, only 4 nations possessed nuclear weapons: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. By 2025, that number had grown to 9: China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, which maintains an official policy of ambiguity but is known to possess a significant arsenal, have joined the ranks. The total number of nuclear warheads has declined since the peak of the Cold War, from more than 60,000 in the 1980s to approximately 13,000 in 2025. But this reduction is deceptive. Modern weapons are far more powerful, accurate, and diverse than those of 1962. And most worryingly, relations between some of these nuclear powers are deeply hostile. India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars since 1947 and nearly came to nuclear war in 2002. North Korea regularly threatens to use nuclear weapons against South Korea, Japan, and the United States. The system of checks and balances that emerged from the missile crisis, arms control treaties, hotlines of communication, crisis management procedures, was designed for a bipolar world. It is unclear whether it will work in a multipolar world where 9 nuclear actors with divergent interests interact simultaneously. May 2002, 40 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world faced its most dangerous moment since. And most people never knew how close they came to nuclear apocalypse. Kashmir, the disputed region between India and Pakistan, erupted in violence after a terrorist attack on the Indian parliament in December 2001, which India blamed on Pakistan-backed groups. India mobilized nearly 1 million troops to the border with Pakistan. Pakistan responded with its own massive mobilization. Both nations had nuclear weapons. India had conducted nuclear tests in 1974 and again in 1998. Pakistan responded with its own tests in 1998. What made the situation particularly dangerous was Pakistan's nuclear doctrine. Unlike India, which had a no-first-use policy, Pakistan had explicitly stated that it would use nuclear weapons if faced with an Indian conventional invasion that threatened the existence of the Pakistani state. And that was exactly what India was planning. Indian military documents obtained by journalists years later revealed plans for massive deep penetration attacks deep into Pakistani territory, designed to destroy terrorist groups' bases and humiliate Pakistan militarily. Had India carried out those plans, Pakistan would have faced exactly the scenario its nuclear doctrine specified as justification for the use of nuclear weapons. The Bush administration intervened desperately. Secretary of State Colin Powell flew to the region multiple times. President Bush personally called the Indian and Pakistani leaders. Massive diplomatic and economic pressure was applied. The CIA conducted intelligence assessments estimating that if nuclear war broke out between India and Pakistan, 12 million people would die in the first few weeks. Nuclear explosions on cities would cause massive famines on the subcontinent. Radioactive fallout would affect all of South Asia. By June 2002, both sides began to de-escalate. Troops were gradually withdrawn from the border. The crisis ended without a gunshot, but it had been awfully close. And unlike the missile crisis, where Kennedy and Khrushchev had relatively firm control over their military forces, in the India-Pakistan case, the situation was more volatile. Terrorist groups that neither government fully controlled could trigger an escalation, Local commanders facing invasion could make fatal decisions before they could consult their capitals. The Kashmir crisis demonstrated that in the 21st century, nuclear war could begin anywhere, not just between traditional superpowers. No nation better illustrates the new nuclear dangers of the 21st century than North Korea. Kim Jong-un's regime has turned nuclear weapons into its guarantee of survival. Unlike other nuclear powers, which view their arsenals primarily as a defensive deterrent, North Korea openly uses nuclear threats as a tool of negotiation and coercion. Since its first nuclear test in 2006, North Korea has detonated 6 nuclear devices, each more powerful than the last. By 2017, it had tested what it claimed was a hydrogen bomb with a yield of hundreds of kilotons, dozens of times more powerful than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. But the real breakthrough came with missiles. By 2017, North Korea had tested the Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missile, with a theoretical range to hit any part of the continental United States, including Washington, D.C. and New York. The crisis reached its peak in August and September 2017. North Korea conducted multiple missile tests, some of which flew over Japan. Kim Jong-un threatened to create a sea of fire around Guam, a U.S. territory. President Donald Trump responded by promising fire and fury like the world has never seen. It was escalatory rhetoric reminiscent of the worst moments of the Cold War. But there was a crucial difference. While Kennedy and Khrushchev were rational leaders of established superpowers with bureaucratic structures that imposed a certain degree of caution, Kim Jong-un was an unpredictable dictator of an isolated state with little to lose. In September 2017, U.S. Senator Bob Corker, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, publicly warned that Trump could be bringing the nation to the brink of World War III. The crisis was eventually de-escalated through a combination of crushing economic sanctions and surprise diplomacy that led to direct meetings between Trump and Kim in 2018 and 2019. But denuclearization was not achieved. By 2025, North Korea possessed an estimated arsenal of 30 to 40 nuclear weapons and continued to expand it. The North Korean regime has demonstrated that a small nation with nuclear weapons can challenge superpowers and survive. It's a lesson other pariah regimes are carefully observing. If North Korea represents a danger of a nuclear-armed rogue state, Iran represents the danger of proliferation, the process by which more nations acquire nuclear capability. Iran's nuclear program has been a source of international tension for decades. Iran insists its program is purely for civilian energy. The United States and Israel maintain it is a covert weapons program. Evidence suggests that Iran has deliberately developed a nuclear threshold capability, the technical ability to rapidly build nuclear weapons if it chose to do so, while technically maintaining its commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In 2015, after years of negotiations, Iran signed a joint comprehensive plan of action with the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China. The agreement severely limited Iran's nuclear program in exchange for relief from economic sanctions. But in 2018, President Trump unilaterally withdrew the United States from the agreement, reimposing sanctions. Iran responded by gradually violating the agreement's limits and expanding its uranium enrichment. By 2025, Iran possesses enough highly enriched uranium to build several nuclear weapons if it chooses to do so. Experts estimate that the breakout time, the time it would take Iran to produce enough material for a bomb if it chose to do so, is just weeks. Israel has made it clear that it will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. It has carried out covert operations to sabotage Iran's nuclear program, assassinations of nuclear scientists, cyber attacks such as the Stuxnet virus that destroyed Iranian centrifuges, and bombings of facilities. The danger is obvious. If Iran decided to build a nuclear weapon, Israel could launch preemptive military strikes. Iran would respond, possibly closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which a third of the world's oil passes. The United States would inevitably be drawn in. The escalation could be swift and catastrophic. And if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, other Middle Eastern states, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, might decide they also need nuclear arsenals to balance Iran's power. The result will be a region with multiple nuclear powers, long-standing and deep-seated sectarian rivalries, and frequently unstable governments. It is a nightmare scenario for nuclear nonproliferation. But perhaps the most terrifying nuclear danger of the 21st century comes not from states, but from non-state actors, terrorist groups seeking to obtain nuclear weapons. Documents captured from al-Qaeda after September 11th revealed that Osama bin Laden had considered obtaining nuclear weapons a religious duty. In 1998, bin Laden issued a fatwa declaring that acquiring weapons of mass destruction is a religious duty. Al-Qaeda attempted to purchase enriched uranium on the black market. It sought to recruit Pakistani nuclear scientists. It explored the possibility of building a dirty bomb, a conventional device that would disperse radioactive material without causing a full-blown nuclear explosion. After bin Laden's death in 2011, the Islamic State, ISIS, continued its pursuit of nuclear capabilities. During its territorial control in Iraq and Syria, ISIS captured nuclear research material from Iraqi facilities, though not enriched enough for a weapon. Security experts' greatest concern isn't that terrorists will build a nuclear weapon from scratch. That requires technical and industrial capability beyond the reach of any terrorist group. The danger is that they will obtain an existing weapon or nuclear material from a state arsenal. The Soviet Union possessed approximately 45,000 nuclear weapons when it collapsed in 1991. In the ensuing chaos, control over these weapons was uncertain. The United States spent billions of dollars on programs like the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program to help secure and dismantle Soviet nuclear weapons. But were they all accounted for? Rumors persist about nuclear suitcases, portable nuclear devices designed for Soviet special forces, that may have disappeared during the collapse. Pakistan presents another concern. Its nuclear arsenal, estimated at 160 weapons, is the fastest growing in the world. But Pakistan also faces internal threats from Islamic extremist groups, some with connections within the military and intelligence services. The nightmare scenario is that extremists within the Pakistani security establishment facilitate the theft of a nuclear weapon or material. A single nuclear device in the hands of terrorists, detonated in a major city, could kill hundreds of thousands of people and completely transform global politics. It would be 9/11 multiplied by 100. 21st century nuclear weapons face a threat that did not exist in 1962: cyber attacks. Modern nuclear command and control systems rely on computer networks for communication, early warning, and launch authorization. These networks are potentially vulnerable to hacking. In 2010, the Stuxnet virus, developed jointly by the United States and Israel, demonstrated the power of cyber weapons. Stuxnet specifically attacked the control system of Iran's nuclear centrifuges, causing them to self-destruct while reporting normal operation. It destroyed approximately 1/5 of Iran's centrifuges without a single physical shot. It was a successful covert operation, but it also opened a Pandora's box. If the United States and Israel could hack Iranian nuclear facilities, what was to stop other states or non-state actors from hacking into American, Russian, or Chinese nuclear systems? The nightmare scenario is that a cyber attack could masquerade as a real missile launch, falsely triggering early warning systems. Or it could interfere with communication systems during a real crisis, preventing leaders from communicating effectively. In 2017, security researchers demonstrated that it was possible to hack commercial satellites. Military systems have better security, but they are not invulnerable. A sophisticated adversary with sufficient resources could potentially compromise critical systems. More worryingly, the proliferation of cyber capabilities means that these skills are not limited to superpowers. North Korea has developed sophisticated cyber capabilities, demonstrating the ability to hack international banks and film studios. Iran has launched cyber attacks against U.S. infrastructure. Criminal and terrorist groups are acquiring cyber tools. The result is a landscape where nuclear arsenals, designed for deterrence during the Cold War, now operate in a cyber environment that no one in 1962 could have imagined. But perhaps the most disturbing development in nuclear warfare is the increasing automation of early warning and response systems. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, human beings made all the critical decisions. Kennedy decided on the quarantine. Khrushchev decided to withdraw the missiles. Arkhipov decided not to launch the nuclear torpedo. Petrov decided the missile alarm was a system error. In each case, human judgment, with all its weaknesses, but also its ability to contextualize, to assess probabilities, to consider consequences, was a determining factor. But modern systems are increasingly automated. Missiles travel faster than they did in 1962. The hypersonic missiles being developed will travel at over Mach 5, reducing warning time to minutes or even seconds. With such compressed decision times, there's pressure to automate responses. Artificial intelligence systems can process sensor data instantly, identify threats, and recommend responses without human intervention. Russia has developed the perimeter system, known in the West as Dead Hand. It is a semi-automated system designed to guarantee nuclear retaliation even if the Russian leadership is eliminated in a first strike. Sensors detect signs of a nuclear attack, radiation, seismic waves, loss of communications, and if confirmed, the system can authorize automatic missile launches without direct human intervention. The United States has rejected such complete automation, but its own systems increasingly incorporate AI assistance for threat analysis. The danger is obvious. What if the AI makes a mistake? What if it falsely identifies a threat? What if a poorly programmed algorithm or corrupted data leads to a recommendation for nuclear launch? In 1962, Stanislav Petrov was able to use his human judgment to determine that an alarm was likely a mistake. If the system had been fully automated, World War III would have started. As nuclear systems become more automated, the margins for human error decrease. But so do the opportunities for human judgment to correct system errors. A threat completely unforeseen in 1962 has emerged in the 21st century: the interaction between nuclear arsenals and climate change. Scientific research published in 2007 and updated in 2019 modeled the climatic consequences of a regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan. The results were terrifying. Even a limited nuclear war involving 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons, less than 1% of the global arsenal, would cause catastrophic global climate effects. The explosions would set cities ablaze, injecting 5 million tons of smoke into the upper atmosphere. The smoke would block sunlight, causing global temperature drops of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius for years. Growing seasons would be dramatically shortened. Global agricultural production would fall by 10 to 40%. Up to 2 billion people could face famine. And that would be a small nuclear war. A full-blown exchange between the United States and Russia, involving thousands of weapons, would cause a complete nuclear winter. Temperatures dropping 10 or more degrees Celsius, rainfall decreasing dramatically, and agriculture being nearly impossible for years. Human civilization would not survive in its current form. Even countries not directly attacked would face social collapse due to famine and climate chaos. Ironically, climate change is also directly affecting nuclear infrastructure. Thawing permafrost in Russia is destabilizing some nuclear facilities in Siberia. Rising sea levels threaten naval bases, housing nuclear submarines. Changing weather patterns are affecting early warning systems designed for 20th century climate conditions. Climate change and nuclear weapons, the two greatest existential threats facing humanity, are interconnected in ways we are only beginning to understand. The arms control architecture built after the Cuban Missile Crisis is collapsing. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987, eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles. It was a historic achievement. But in 2019, the United States withdrew from the treaty, citing Russian violations. Russia responded by withdrawing as well. The treaty is dead. The Open Skies Treaty, which allowed unarmed reconnaissance flights over the territory of signatories to verify compliance with arms agreements, was abandoned by the United States in 2020. Russia followed suit in 2021. New START, the last major treaty limiting U.S. and Russian strategic arsenals, was extended in 2021 for an additional 5 years, but is set to expire in 2026. Negotiations for its replacement or further extension have stalled due to tensions over Ukraine and other issues. Without these treaties, there are no legally binding limits on how many nuclear weapons the United States and Russia can build. There are no verification mechanisms to monitor arsenals. There are no agreed-upon procedures to reduce the risk of accidental war. It is a return to the atmosphere of mutual distrust and unrestricted arms race that existed before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this time, the race isn't just bilateral. China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal. U.S. satellites have detected the construction of hundreds of new missile silos in the Chinese desert. Estimates suggest that China could have 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030, compared to approximately 350 currently. Without arms control frameworks that include China, India, Pakistan, and other nuclear powers, the world is heading toward a new era of nuclear proliferation and competition without the safeguards that existed during the Cold War. Despite all modern technology, nuclear false alarms have not disappeared. In fact, they continue to occur with frightening regularity. In 2012, a Russian early warning satellite detected what appeared to be a massive missile launch from the Mediterranean Sea toward Russia. For several minutes, Russian officials believed they were under attack. Only when multiple systems failed to confirm the launch was it determined there had been an error caused by solar reflection off clouds, exactly like the Petrov incident in 1983. In 2013, a NATO training exercise nearly caused panic in the Russian nuclear command when signals from the exercise were misinterpreted as actual preparations for an attack. In 2018, a Hawaii Emergency Management Agency employee accidentally sent a real-life incoming ballistic missile alert to every cell phone in the state. For 38 minutes, more than 1 million people believed a nuclear attack on Hawaii was imminent. Panic was widespread. Families said goodbye. People desperately sought shelter. It turned out to be human error. The employee had activated the real alert instead of the test alert. But during those 38 minutes, Hawaii experienced a terror that all of humanity would have felt if the Cuban Missile Crisis had escalated into nuclear war. And these are just the incidents that became public. Declassified documents revealed dozens of additional false alarms that were never reported at the time. Each is a reminder that nuclear systems, no matter how sophisticated, are operated by fallible humans, depend on imperfect technology, and exist in a world of increasing complexity where errors are inevitable. The question isn't whether there will be more false alarms. The question is whether, next time, human judgment will be sufficient to prevent a false alarm from escalating into an actual nuclear war. Perhaps the most worrying change since 1962 is that most of humanity no longer viscerally understands the danger of nuclear weapons. For the generation that lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, that practiced bomb shelter exercises in schools, that saw the images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that grew up under the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation, the danger was real and immediate. But for generations born after the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons are abstract, relics of a bygone era, theoretical threats that never materialized. This complacency is dangerous. When people don't understand the danger, political leaders feel no pressure to prioritize it. Arms control treaties collapse without significant public protest. Nuclear security budgets are slashed. Early warning systems age without adequate modernization. And when a crisis arises, over Taiwan, Kashmir, Korea, the Middle East, the public doesn't understand how quickly it could escalate into a nuclear catastrophe. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha, have dedicated their lives to warning about the horrors of nuclear weapons. But their numbers are dwindling every year. Soon there will be no one alive who has directly experienced a nuclear attack. And without that visceral memory, without that constant reminder of what is at stake, humanity risks making the same mistakes that nearly destroyed the world in October 1962. Only this time, with 9 nuclear powers, larger arsenals, more complex technology, and shorter decision-making time, we might not be as lucky as we were then. But there's one question that has haunted every nuclear security analyst since the Cuban Missile Crisis. A question no one wants to ask out loud, but everyone thinks about privately. The question is not, can another nuclear crisis occur? The question is, why hasn't this happened yet? Because the numbers are clear. In the 62 years since the missile crisis, there have been dozens of moments where a nuclear war almost started by accident, misunderstanding, or escalation of a crisis. We've been lucky, very lucky, more luck than any civilization should need to survive. But luck eventually runs out. Experts have a term for this: cumulative conditional probability. Every day that passes with existing nuclear arsenals is another day something could go wrong, and the probabilities accumulate. If there's a 1 in 100 chance of an accidental nuclear meltdown each year, then over 100 years, the cumulative probability of at least one meltdown is 63%. It's not a matter of if, but when, and that brings us to the final episode of this story, the only ending that truly matters. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't end in 1962. It never really ended. It continues to develop every day that nuclear weapons exist, and the end of this story has yet to be written